But it wasn't until I read The Conquest of Bread when I was about 15 that I really understood anarchism. And
what's The Conquest of Bread?
It's a great book by Peter Kropotkin, where he takes France at the time he's living there and looks at the economics of the country. And if you're interested as to how anarchism might work, I'd suggest that book very highly. It's a great book.
But he wrote that in the 19th century. How did you relate to that?
Well, it's funny. This is a bit of a tangent, but I also worked with this time I worked with a group called the Anarchist Black Cross that wrote letters to prisoners. And one day we sent a lot of pamphlets to prisoners, and one of the things we sent was a pamphlet by Peter Kropotkin. I think it was called "Prison and Its Moral Influence on Prisoners." I could be a little off there, but one day we got a letter back from a prisoner asking to speak to Mr. Kropotkin. Because he might have been gone 100 years, but his language is as close to timeless as I've seen. He could really speak to the human experience in a way that I hope one day to achieve, but I'm pretty far off.
Well, he didn't write in English, did he?
No.
So,
but I can't read Russian, so.
No, but you got a good translation. That's what it comes down to.
I guess so.
Yeah, good. So then you identified with anarchism, and you went with it.
I'm pretty stubborn.
Good for you.
Once I get a hold of something, I kind of run with it.
That's great. And you, so you got involved with BAM. It already existed by then.
Yeah, and I went to the anti-war march, and as I mentioned, I was very emotional about the state of politics in our country. And I saw people who were really willing to put their bodies on the line and to put in the effort to try to create a better world, the type of world that, I thought we deserve to live in. A couple months after that, some of these same anarchists were involved in a strike at a theater in Somerville.
Oh, yes.
Which very much touched on my readings of anarchism, that, anarchism wasn't just about, being angry and protesting and whatnot. It was about organizing and trying to make people's lives better from the day to day. And I think that's really what kept me going.
And from there, what? Lots of other things, I bet.
Yeah.
From one struggle to the next.
Yeah, and that's really the great part about writing a book, because while you're in the midst of it all, it's kind of a whirlwind. It's sort of hard to analyze what you're doing, thinking about how successful things are. And when you look back at things and interview people and read the things that you had written back then, you can really put it into perspective. But we did a lot of things. I mentioned the fun type events. We used to do like kids games that had radical messages or...
And was that for kids or was that for everybody?
Well, it was for kids, but it was also for their parents, who would laugh about the joke or, talk about the politics behind it. But the kids had fun. Yeah,
good. Exactly right. I remember reading BAM, over the years, the newsletter, that is, over the years that it existed, 2007 to 2010. Seems like longer, but I trust you. You're the expert. And I remember
I wouldn't claim to be an expert on anything.
Well, you just wrote a book on it. That makes you an expert.
I guess so.
I remember thinking a lot of the time, there's an awful lot about international struggles. And that's really important. I'm personally very interested. But I was not sure that was the right strategy for educating and organizing Boston area anarchists. What was the thinking behind that in the editorial collective?
Well, honestly, I very much agree with you. And I made, while I wrote a lot about some of the international things, I also made some of these same points at the time. The thing about BAM, through most of its years, how it was distinct from a lot of different anarchist groups, as I mentioned before, is it was open to anarchists of all different stripes. That includes, long-term vision as well as immediate strategy. And there wasn't really a core editing group. I mean, there were... The thing about very informal groups is they develop informal hierarchies, which, at least in BAM, was more or less the people who were willing to actually do it. Everybody would complain to them, but they had no power to, decide things or whatnot. So we pretty much had to let almost anything in.
Yeah.
A lot of it was good stuff. A lot of it, I wouldn't necessarily publish in a paper if I was starting a new one, which I am. A few friends of ours are about to launch a new paper in a couple of months. And like you mentioned, it's actually going to be almost completely focused on local Boston struggles. It's going to have the anarchist politic, but we're not going to use the word too much or beat people over the head with it. For us, the more important thing is to promote the concept that normal, everyday people can struggle, can fight, and can help their communities and help their workplaces and help their neighbors to, build better lives in the here and now. Obviously, the concepts of social justice and idealism will fall in with the writing.
I think that brings up a question that I've been thinking about as we've been talking, which is, and I've been thinking about for some years, let's say, which is the kind of a struggle between theory and practice for anarchists. I think in some ways more so than for a lot of Marxists and communists who aren't anarchists. Theory is important. I think everybody knows that, and it's important to understand why inequality and injustice exist in the world and ways that it can be ameliorated or abolished. And theory is really important in that, but practice is essential. Otherwise, we're just talking again. And the concept of praxis, which is sort of the synthesis of theory and practice, has been very important for a lot of anarchists over the years. And there's a lot of theory in your book and in the newsletter that you're drawing from for your book. How was and again, I hear what you're saying, that there was maybe not a formal decision
There wasn't
made.
much strategy.
Yeah, exactly. But why are you, I get the feeling in the new paper that you're planning that it's going to be a lot more focused on practice. Why?
Well, just like when I was 14 and trying to figure out what anarchism meant, and I didn't have people around me who were struggling, it was a lot harder to understand.
So you grew up in a fairly
I grew up in a small town.
Privileged background.
I was fairly privileged. I mean, we weren't rich. My father was a plumber. I grew up in a small town called Franklin, and when that got bigger, we moved to Norfolk, which was an even smaller town at the time.
But you grew up in a white middle class
more
situation
or less.
for the most part. Yeah,
More or less. It was very quiet.